What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for MLB Friday, October 1st.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top DFS picks for today's MLB slate.
And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made.
Oh, and good news, guys. Make sure to stay tuned to the very end of this video because we removed the box that was popping up and blocking the lineup. So now you can see a full lineup using these picks that we made in this video if you stay to the very end. Okay, guys, we have a 14-game slate tonight, and I got a bunch of fantastic picks for you. So let's take a look at the pitcher position. I like Lynn with a small pitching advantage over a low salary batting team, the Detroit Tigers. Lynn is only giving up a .652 OPS versus righties and a .529 OPS versus switch hitters. He's facing 4 righties and 4 switch hitters, and on top of that, the Tigers have only hit 17 of his last 83 pitches. That's a .205 batting average and a pretty big sample size. So Lynn is 10,000 FanDuel salary, 500 less on DraftKings, projected at 36.5 fantasy points here tonight. He has an ERA of 2.72. His record is 10-6 on the season, pitching an average of 94 pitches per game, averaging 35 fantasy points per game. He scored 18, 28, and 42 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Lynn here versus the Detroit Tigers. Now, if you want to save some salary at the pitcher position, take a look at Marco Gonzalez. Pitching against a low salary batting team, the Los Angeles Angels. Marco Gonzalez is giving up a .662 OPS versus lefties and a .729 OPS versus righties. He's facing 3 lefties and 5 righties. And on top of that, the Angels have only hit 18 of his last 107 pitches. That's a 168 batting average and a pretty big sample size. So Marco Gonzalez is only 8,100 FanDuel salary, 300 more on DraftKings, projected at 29.8 fantasy points here tonight. He has an ERA of 3.87. His record is 10-5 on the season, pitching an average of 93 pitches per game, averaging 27 fantasy points per game, and he's been on fire, scoring 43, 31, and 34 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And I like this pick because Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game. 7.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Marco Gonzalez here versus the Los Angeles Angels. Oh, and another good pick if you want to save salary, take a look at Anthony Descalfani with a 2% pitching advantage over a low salary batting team, the San Diego Padres. Anthony Descalfani is only giving up a .695 OPS versus righties. He's facing 4 righties, and I like this pick because the Padres have only hit 25 of his last 117 pitches. That's a .214 batting average, and Anthony Descalfani is only 7,500 FanDuel salary. He's 300 less on DraftKings, projected at 28.3 fantasy points here tonight. He has an ERA of 3.26. Record is 12-7 on the season, pitching an average of 75 pitches per game, averaging 27 fantasy points per game, and he scored 15, 34, and 36 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Anthony Descalfani here versus the San Diego Padres. Okay, let's take a look at the catcher first base position. I like Freddie Freeman with a 73% batting advantage over Tyler Megill. Freddie Freeman is batting 31% better versus righty pitchers, batting a 1.095 OPS versus righties. And Taylor Megill, he pitches his worst ball by far to lefty batters, 42% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.014 OPS versus lefties. And Freddie Freeman is 4 for 8 with a 1 OPS versus Megill. He's $3,900 FanDuel salary, $1,600 more on DraftKings, projected at 12.5 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 6, 6, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So Freddie Freeman is all coiled up, ready to hit a ball out of the park. I think he's one of my home run hitters, my dong of the day. So I like Freddie Freeman here versus Taylor Megill.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
I also like Ryan Mountcastle with a 5% batting advantage over Steven Matz. Ryan Mountcastle is batting a .791 OPS versus lefties, and Steven Matz, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 9% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .916 OPS versus righties. Now Ryan Mountcastle is 3 for 7, batting a .429 batting average and a 1.357 OPS versus Matz. He's $3,200 FanDuel salary, $1,100 more on DraftKings, projected at 9.2 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 29, 3, and 22 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 10 runs scored in this game, so I like Ryan Mountcastle here versus Steven Matz. Now I also like Bobby Dahlback with a 75% batting advantage over Josh Rogers. Bobby Dahlback is batting 15% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .974 OPS versus lefties, and Josh Rogers, he pitches his worst ball by far to righty batters, 60% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .857 OPS versus righties. There's no at-bats versus Rogers yet, and Bobby Dahlback is $3,000 FanDuel salary, only $700 more on DraftKings, projected at 12.6 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. Now he's been in a slump. He hasn't scored any fantasy points in his last 3 games, but he's got a great matchup and good splits here tonight, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game, so I like Bobby Dahlback here versus Josh Rogers. Okay, let's take a look at the second base position. So I got another home run hitter, dong of the day. I like Trea Turner with a 41% batting advantage over Eric Lauer. Trea Turner is batting 24% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a 1.130 OPS versus lefties. And Eric Lauer, he pitches 17% worse to righties as he does lefties, giving up a .872 OPS versus righties. And Trea Turner is 3 for 7 with a .429 batting average and a 1 OPS versus Lauer. He's $3,400 FanDuel salary, $1,300 more on DraftKings, projected at 11.3 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 9, 10, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Trea Turner here versus Eric Lauer. I also like Enrique Hernandez with a 66% batting advantage over Josh Rogers. Enrique Hernandez is batting 6% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .764 OPS versus lefties. And Josh Rogers, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, giving up a .857 OPS versus righties. There's no at-bats versus Rogers yet, and Enrique Hernandez is $3,400 FanDuel salary, $1,400 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.6 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 19, 3, and 0 fantasy points in his last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Enrique Hernandez here versus Josh Rogers. Okay, let's take a look at the third base position. I like Ryan McMahon with a 12% batting advantage over Humberto Castellanos. Ryan McMahon is batting 8% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .765 OPS versus righties, and Humberto Castellanos, he pitches his worst ball versus lefty batters, giving up a .830 OPS versus lefties. Ryan McMahon is 1 for 2 with a 1 OPS versus Castellanos. He's $3,400 FanDuel salary, $800 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season, and he's been on fire, scoring 35, 10, and 26 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Ryan McMahon here versus Humberto Castellanos. I also like Jonathan Villar. So this is a value play. Jonathan Villar has a 45% batting advantage over Huascar Ynoa. Jonathan Villar is batting 4% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .683 OPS versus righties. And Huascar Ynoa, he pitches his worst ball by far to switch hitters. 41% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.081 OPS versus switch hitters. There's no at-bats versus Ynoa yet, but I like this pick because Jonathan Villar is only $2,500 FanDuel salary, only $700 more on DraftKings, projected at 11 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 8 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 16, 0, and 13 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Jonathan Villar here versus Huascar Ynoa.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the shortstop position. My man, Xander Bogaerts, with a 68% batting advantage over Josh Rogers. Xander Bogaerts is batting 8% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .925 OPS versus lefties, and Josh Rogers pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, giving up a .857 OPS versus righties. So Xander Bogaerts is 0 for 1 versus Rogers, and he's $3,700 FanDuel salary, $1,900 more on DraftKings, projected at 13.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 3, 9, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I think Bogaerts is due for a big game here, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game. So I like Xander Bogaerts here versus Josh Rogers. I also like J.P. Crawford with a 24% batting advantage over a low-salary pitcher, Jose Suarez. J.P. Crawford is batting a .677 OPS versus lefties, and Jose Suarez, he pitches his worst ball versus lefty batters, 26% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.416 OPS versus lefties. And I like this pick because J.P. Crawford is 4 for 11 with a .364 batting average and a .909 OPS versus Suarez. He's $3,000 FanDuel salary, $1,100 more on DraftKings, projected at 13.1 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season, and he scored 6, 12, and 22 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like J.P. Crawford here versus Jose Suarez. Okay, I got another value play for you. I like Miguel Rojas with a 76% batting advantage over Ranger Suarez. Miguel Rojas is batting 43% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a 1.157 OPS versus lefties, and Ranger Suarez, he pitches his worst ball by far to righty batters, 33% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.024 OPS versus righties. Miguel Rojas is 4 for 12, batting a .333 batting average and a .833 OPS versus Suarez. And I like this pick because he's only $2,600 FanDuel salary. He's $1,600 more on DraftKings, so I love that FanDuel price. Projected at 10.8 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 0, 10, and 0 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Miguel Rojas here versus Ranger Suarez. Okay, moving on to the outfield position. Now, this was my dong of the day yesterday, and he is today as well. I like JD Martinez with a 57% batting advantage over Josh Rogers. JD Martinez is batting a .749 OPS versus lefties. We know Josh Rogers pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, giving up a .857 OPS versus righties. And JD Martinez is 1 for 2 with a 1 OPS versus Rogers. He's $3,800 FanDuel salary, $1,000 more on DraftKings, projected at 9.8 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 9, 38, and 0 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like JD Martinez here versus Josh Rogers. So here's a value play. I like Rafael Ortega with a 48% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Dakota Hudson. Rafael Ortega is batting 57% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .873 OPS versus righties, and Dakota Hudson is giving up a .651 OPS versus lefties. Rafael Ortega is 1 for 2 with a 1.5 OPS versus Hudson, and he's only $2,700 FanDuel salary and only $200 more on DraftKings. So I like that price on both sites. He's projected at 9.8 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 8 fantasy points per game on the season. But take a look at this. He's been on fire, scoring 40, 12, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And he's got good splits here tonight, so I like Rafael Ortega here versus Dakota Hudson. I also like Nelson Cruz with a 21% batting advantage over Nestor Cortes. Nelson Cruz is batting 29% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a 1.173 OPS versus lefties, and Nestor Cortes is giving up a 1.020 OPS versus righties. Nelson Cruz is 1 for 1 with a 5 OPS versus Cortes because that one hit was for a home run. He's $3,400 FanDuel salary, $1,700 more on DraftKings, projected at 15.2 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 0, 12, and 0 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Nelson Cruz here versus Nestor Cortes. Okay, another value play, I like Miles Straw with a 46% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Spencer Howard. Miles Straw is batting 56% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .735 OPS versus righties, and Spencer Howard is giving up a .821 OPS versus righties. There's no at-bats versus Howard yet, and Miles Straw is only $2,800 FanDuel salary, although he is $1,800 more on DraftKings, so probably a FanDuel play for me only. He's projected at 10.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season, and he scored 12, 16, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Miles Straw here versus Spencer Howard. Another value play, and this is a good play on both sites, take a look at Brian Dela Cruz with a 48% batting advantage over Ranger Suarez. Brian Dela Cruz is batting 15% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .946 OPS versus lefties. And Ranger Suarez, we know, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, giving up a 1.024 OPS versus righties. Now there's no at-bats versus Suarez yet, but Brian Dela Cruz is only $2,800 FanDuel salary and the same price on DraftKings, so I like that price on both sites. Projected at 9.1 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 8 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 3, 0, and 0 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Brian Dela Cruz here versus Ranger Suarez. And another value play for you, take a look at Max Kepler with a 98% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, John Heasley. Max Kepler is batting 46% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .852 OPS versus righties, and John Heasley, he pitches his worst ball versus lefty batters, giving up a 1.875 OPS versus lefties. There's no at-bats versus Heasley yet, and Max Kepler is only $2,600 FanDuel salary. He's $1,100 more on DraftKings, projected at 11.6 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 9, 7, and 4 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Max Kepler here versus John Heasley. Now on DraftKings, for only $2,700, I like Hunter Dozier over Max Kepler. But let's take a look at another value play here. I like David Peralta with a 24% batting advantage over John Gray. David Peralta is batting 13% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .776 OPS versus righties. And John Gray, he pitches his worst ball versus lefty batters, 11% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .827 OPS versus lefties. Now I like this pick because David Peralta is 19 for 42, batting a .452 batting average and a 1.048 versus Gray, and that's a huge sample size. And he's only $2,300 FanDuel salary. He's $1,100 more on DraftKings, projected at 9.5 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 8 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 0, 7, and 3 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So probably one of my favorite value plays on the slate, especially on FanDuel. I think he's a lock over there on FanDuel. So I like David Peralta here versus John Gray.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.